you had no rivals to that title. Virtually everyone here would have a Hugh McGraw's story or stories to tell, and would be influenced by him in some significantly positive way. But we don't have time for all of us to speak. So I'm here because I knew Hugh, and we were friends for over 50 years, and for a good portion of that, we're very good friends. And two, because from 1969 to 1976, I lived in Carrollton, and I served as Hugh's unofficial assistant. And he was my generous friend and mentor. And I had the opportunity, he took me along for the ride with all of his Sacred Harp journeys. And that meant not only attending Sacred Harp singings throughout the country, but then going to singing presentations he made and participation with groups throughout the broader country. Now, Hugh and I had our disagreements. We had a few rough patches over those years, and I have taken and take responsibility for the major part of that. But what I appreciated so much out of all of that was Hugh's attitude that if you wanted to have a real heart-to-heart talk with him, he would welcome that and would work with you to try to find a satisfactory conclusion. And Risa and Paula, you may appreciate hearing that at one of those sessions we had in the parking lot at McDonald's, I think, when I was driving over from Birmingham, and I had listed my list of complaints. He said, everything you said to me, my family has already said to me before. So I needed to acknowledge that, but it also establishes some credential, because you had to be rather close to Hugh to be able to tussle with him. And we did have our few tussles, but we remained friends, and I'm thankful for that to the end. So what can I bring to this part of the service? Well, I hope a long perspective. I'm not going to read out the long, long list of Hugh's accomplishments and honors. They're listed and briefly recapped, actually, in his obituary. They're written in books, the two of which I had a hand in, and most of you know most of them anyway. But what I can bring is the perspective of someone who has tried to be a student of the Sacred Harp phenomenon that Hugh devoted his life to, someone who observed him very closely over that period, and I think came to know him well. One thing the two of us had in common is that neither of us grew up singing Sacred Harp. For Hugh, it was gospel music in the background, gospel quartets that he loved to listen to. And then in 1953, when he was 22, he ventured into Holly Springs here, and immediately, he said, felt a shiver at the sound he heard. The same shiver we may have felt today when we first started singing 36 on the bottom. And when the class sang Alabama, page 196, the song that Pam and Rivendell led today, he said, I thought then that that was the prettiest thing I'd ever heard in my life. And so that evening, he went home and he called his cousin, Uncle Bud McGraw, and asked him to teach him to sing Sacred Harp. And thus commenced his life in Sacred Harp. And he jumped in with both feet. He learned, he conquered every song in the book, experimented with every part in every song. And there he is in the late 50s on the revision committee for what would turn out to be the 1960 edition of the Denson book. What a godsend he must have seemed to the stewards of the tradition at that time. Those old heads, a number of elderly folks, and they were all elderly. There were some strong personalities, surely among them. One thinks of Marcus Cable. No. But as a group, they were rudderless. Payne Benson having died in 1955. They were directionless. They were reactive rather than proactive. And as a body, they had no apparent ability to move the Sacred Heart boundaries beyond its retreating boundaries, to move Sacred Heart out of that. So there was a leadership vacuum. And then here comes Hugh McGraw, this good-looking guy with all the personality in the world, with a Sacred Heart pedigree, who already knew the songbook inside and out. A take charge guy, a man of ideas. We haven't done it this way before, well, let's try it this way. He had organization ability, creativity. Amanda Benson Brady, Hugh was like a second daddy to her, would sometimes say about someone that they knew how. Well, Hugh McGraw knew how. He knew what to do and how to accomplish it. You've probably seen or read about these great icebreaker ships. Hugh was the Sacred Heart's icebreaker ship. He plunged the Sacred Heart into new territories, brushing aside whatever obstacles were there. And he made a bridge between the traditional way and the singers in the rural South to these new outcroppings, small outcroppings of Sacred Harp around the country, often in college towns or cities. Those were thin, tepid exercises where small groups would gather maybe once a month and sing the same 15 or 20 songs sitting in a circle. And then along came Hugh. He found out about them, or they invited him to come or something, and he told them how. The legends abound. Some of the singers from Illinois here particularly know the story well. Hugh would say to them, well, of course you sing notes. You sing notes as well as the words. You sit in a square and face each other. You each lead a song and so forth. He brought them to our side of the river. He was our Johnny Appleseed. I was with you many times when he addressed groups of professional or semi-professional musicians, musicologists, and it was great fun to see. I've written about this. He was especially good at puncturing the snootiness of the applause for the more sophisticated the group, the better his brand of humor, country humor, and chutzpah played. And I think of this quotation in Newsweek. Joe Cumming was the Southern Bureau Chief for Newsweek, and he came in 1978, I guess it was, 1978. Came here to Holly Springs and interviewed Hugh and followed him around. And at one point he asked about the religious affiliation of the singers there. And Hugh famously said, we got Southern Baptists, Methodists, even a lot of Catholics. You might even find some hypocrites here. Well, and we isolate the word hypocrite. Did anybody, anywhere, ever think that Hugh McGraw was a hypocrite? No, if you were around him at any time, you knew that whatever was on his mind was what he said. He was not the least person to do that. But he had a great way of brashly breaking through those barriers. He was a man of action. A story I shared with you, one of my bosses at Bell South had taken a psychological evaluation as part of his executive training, and he told me that there was a quality or attribute, couldn't remember what it was called, but he said it was the opposite of being decisive. And he scored 3% on it. I don't know if Hugh had taken that score, if he would even have reached the 3rd percentile. He was exceptionally decisive, wasn't he? It didn't take him long to size up a situation and realize what should be done and put it into action. Whatever it was needed, whatever any group, wherever needed anything, Hugh was there to provide the help and support and his own person. He was a great teacher, patient, tireless. If the group was young children, oldsters, group in between, and he brought to that the same fresh enthusiasm every time, it seemed. I wonder if he kept a list, if he had a number of all the singing schools he taught, and must have been extensive. He had, and this has been touched on, I guess, already, a gift for delegating. As those of us who were often recipients of that gift could testify. Charlene, Carlene, Buford, Buell, Richard, here, take this, go over here and do that. And you did it. You absolutely did it. Whatever it was he told you to do. He knew what he had in mind and you learned it. And thereby, he helped to train us. He gave quick directions and helped to bring us along. He shepherded the Sacred Heart Publishing Company and its many projects. And critical to that, one thing that was imprinted on him from early on was the importance of guarding the Sacred Heart tradition, keeping it intact, and equally to guard the character of the songbook, to keep it true to dispersed harmony. He well knew the difference between the gospel sound he grew up around and the Sacred Heart sound. And in his compositions, in his editing, in his consultations with others, he never strayed very far from that. And I think that's one of his most important contributions to our songbook itself. His obituary rightly mentions his role in bringing together the black and white manifestations of Sacred Heart. His friendship with the great Dewey Williams, the leader of the Wiregrass Singers, black singers from South Alabama, was a joy to behold. And with the National Convention, which he created, he made it possible for those groups to sing together regularly. With traveling with you, or traveling separately, I had the opportunity over those many years to observe many effective leaders in Sacred Heart. But I can easily say that Hugh McGraw was the most dynamic leader I ever saw in the square. He inhabited the song. He rode on top of it. He drove us through it. He was completely at home in that song. And I can't imagine a class ever running away with a song that he was leading, or dragging behind what he had. The beat that he kept was so firm, and he knew exactly what he wanted and could take the class wherever it was he wanted them to go. As I've written, when he was especially energized or inspired, his movements were dazzlingly quick and sweeping. He could bring the group up together with his arm. And I am sorry that those who came to us later and were not able to observe Hugh in his prime missed seeing that marvelous thing. Hugh had a great sense of humor. He loved observing the quirks of folks. He had a lot of wit about him himself. Those of us who were around him would often hear him laugh or giggle at things. And I brought along today something that I think fits with that, a little anecdote that I wrote about in my most recent book, and let me read that quickly. Hugh was, among other things, a master showman. A little incident at Holly Springs, roughly now 30 years ago, reveals the trait. The church on this occasion was packed, the singing vigorous. At some break point in the later morning, Hugh, as chair of the event, announced that he had in his hand something no one had ever seen before. Stepping around the podium, he moved into the square and held out his clasped hand. For that moment of quiet, he had everyone's rapt attention, with observers in the far corners of the room craning to see. Unfolding his fist, he produced a peanut shell, still intact, crushed it, and held aloft the kernel, pink and innocent for us all to behold. There was a general sigh of appreciation for the simple truth he had laid bare. And nobody will ever see it again, he said, and popped it into his mouth. No discussion of Hugh would be close to complete without touching on his extraordinary generosity and kindness to others, to individuals and to groups. Material generosity, generosity of time and spirit. Hugh was a superb friend. I think for Ruth Denson Edwards, he was the ultimate friend. He revered her, and she absolutely adored him. And as has been said, he called her probably every day of her life, at least once a week, sometimes more than that, right on up to her death at age 84. Raymond Hamrick, Tony Smith, Kelly Beard, so many were great friends of his, and he worked at that friendship, kept them close at hand. He set a high standard for the rest of us to follow, didn't he? Hugh had a phenomenal memory, and that's one of the things I personally will miss the most. The ability to call him at any point and ask who someone was all those years ago, or where it was, or what happened. It might take him just a moment. He'd say, oh yeah, that was so-and-so, and that was such and such. Really, really incredible. I was also very impressed by the graceful way in which Hugh sort of retired from the center of the square. When it became obvious to him that he could no longer be stable in his leading, he simply announced that he would lead no more, and only made exceptions to that in a couple of circumstances. He moved from the front row of the bass to the second or third row, knowing that his voice was by then no longer really needed. Which brings to mind a saying rightly attributed to Hugh. Many of you have heard this. It's one of the most famous ones, and there were different variations of it, which was, I'd walk a mile or I'd walk 50 miles to sing Sacred Heart, but I wouldn't walk across the street to listen to it. Well, that was a breakthrough point. It pointed to the necessarily participatory nature of Sacred Heart and its appeal. But I wouldn't say it was entirely accurate. Many of us have watched Hugh sit back and take in a Sacred Heart singing, and particularly here these last few years. But he still wanted to be there. He wanted to observe and to listen to others sing. So finally, he was the giant among us. We've all been touched by him or by what he created. We haven't seen his like before, and I don't think it's likely we will see his like again. I celebrate with you his life, his friendship, and his amazing contributions. Risa and Paula, thank you for allowing me to speak. Thanks to the rest for your indulgence.